There are dogs in the yard, howling at the moon. There are sinners like me, our judgment's coming soon. And I stand at the bottom of this dark and lonely well, singing, please give me answers, so I might escape hell. I watched from my window as they gunned down the numb men, try to say it's not my problem, couldn't happen to my friends, but the truth is they're my brothers and they're my countrymen, and if we lose our better angels, we won't get them back again. Come on and raise your voice above the raging seas. We can't hold our breath forever when our brothers cannot breathe. Come on and raise your voice above the raging seas. We can't hold our breath forever when our sisters cannot breathe. When I lived outside Atlanta, in Durham and Nashville, I spent years in California, in the valleys and the hills, and they say we fixed the problem. Yeah, we all live the dream, but when shots ring out in Charleston, tell me who are the ones that bleed? Come on and raise your voice above the raging seas. We can't hold our breath forever when our brothers cannot breathe. Come on and raise your voice above the raging seas. We can't hold our breath forever when our sisters cannot breathe. Oh, 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 oh. Our brothers cannot breathe. Oh, 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 oh. Our sisters cannot breathe. All good people, won't you come around? Won't you come around? Won't you come around? All good people, won't you come around? Won't you come around? Defend your brothers. All good people, won't you come around? Won't you come around? Won't you come around? All good people, won't you come around? Won't you come around? Hold up each other. All good people, won't you come around? Won't you come around? Won't you come around? All good people, won't you come around? Won't you come around? Defend your brothers. All good people, won't you come around? Won't you come around? Won't you come around? All good people, won't you come around? Won't you come around? Hold up each other.
Clicking down at the bottom and say show subtitle, then everyone will be able to see live captioning happening down at the bottom. All right, and with that, I would love to welcome Esta Solar, who is going to offer a welcoming message.
Hello, and welcome to the National Conference on Health and Domestic Violence. I am Esta Solar, and on behalf of all of my colleagues at Futures Without Violence and our amazing conference steering committee made up of leaders from across the fields of health and violence prevention, welcome to our 9th National Conference on Health and Domestic Violence. This is our first conference in a virtual format. Thank you for joining us on this exciting new journey, which has allowed even more people to participate in this year's conference than ever before. We do love innovation at Futures, but I would have preferred to be in the room with you in person rather than speaking to you from this screen. But don't worry, This virtual space will provide the thought-provoking and cutting-edge discussions and learnings, movement building, and professional and personal connection you have all come to expect from this biannual gathering. The last year has underscored the importance of connection and support we provide each other. And our healthcare and other frontline workers, many of you in this virtual room with us today, have been making the greatest sacrifices to keep us all safe. And I know I speak for everyone here when I offer my deepest thank you and gratitude for all that you do. This last year has also brought extraordinary attention and activism and urgency to our work to confront racism, health disparities, and other social inequities in the U.S. and beyond. The plenary sessions in this conference will address racism, state violence, and child sexual abuse. They are even more relevant this year as the pandemic shines a bright light on the inequities that have been entrenched in our society for way too long. We have always been proud of this conference. It is one of the country's largest conferences on violence against women and children. It holds a unique space in these essential conversations, bringing the health world together with advocates and activists, cutting-edge researchers, and academics. So I thank you for being here and taking part in these important conversations at this very pivotal time. And thank you to our funders and our partners in the work to promote health and public health solutions and prevention to violence. And thank you to the Family Violence Prevention and Services Program for supporting this work for so many decades, and our other sponsors of today's conference, the Blue Shield of California Foundation and the Allstate Foundation. I know we will learn, we will teach others, and get energized so we can do even more to make a difference in our communities. So from the bottom of my heart, thank you for joining us.
And now we'll hear from Virginia Duplessis. If the tech team could please pin Virginia Duplessis and spotlight her while also the ASL interpreter. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I am so excited to welcome you to our 9th biennial National Conference on Health and Domestic Violence. Thank you so much to Vocal Rush for kicking off our event with your beautiful song, and to Esta Solar for your welcoming remarks. My name is Virginia Duplessis, and I'm the director of the National Health Resource Center on Domestic Violence. As many of you know, our conference really seeks to build partnerships between the health and anti-violence movement to better prevent and address violence. Over the next 4 days, we're going to be taking a deep dive into the intersecting and pressing topics in our fields so that we can move towards a system of care that allows for true prevention, healing, wellness, and accountability to take place. We have got almost 2,000 people joining us in this virtual Zoom room today, folks from all over the country, and in fact, from all over the world. I am joining you today from the Futures Without Violence offices in the San Francisco Bay Area, which is on native land and unceded territory of the coastal Miwok and Ohlone peoples. Before we get started, I'd like to express gratitude for folks that have helped get us here today. First of all, to Liliana, Andrea, Annabelle, Noemi, Tabs, and all of our interpreters and captioners who are helping to make our event even more accessible this year. Our behind the scenes logistics heroes at Confex and Do Good Events. And as Esta mentioned in her remarks, we have an incredible steering committee, a formidable group of leaders in the field who have really helped shape our agenda. And of course, we wouldn't be here today without all of our conference speakers. You've all been working in your communities on the front lines over the past year during the pandemic to provide care and innovative strategies for wellness and safety against innumerable odds. We are so grateful to have you here with us, to learn from and with you over the next 4 days. And lastly, we want to dedicate this year's conference to Debbie Lee. As one of the foremothers of Futures Without Violence, she has worked tirelessly over the past 40 years and really helped to elevate the national conversation to make domestic violence a healthcare issue. Debbie retired last summer, a much deserved retirement, but we miss her. And we're just so grateful for her leadership and contributions, continuing contributions. And I can see her in the Zoom room today. So why don't we go ahead and get started? For our opening keynote entitled Moving Beyond Carceral Approaches to Address and Prevent Violence. In the last 30 years, there's really been a significant focus on the criminal legal system as a strategy to address violence. This investment has contributed to mass incarceration, destabilized communities, and impeded public health without achieving true healing, equity, safety, or justice for many survivors and their families. We must move towards prevention, public health, and community-based solutions now. We're so honored to have two leaders in advocating for alternatives to the criminal legal system, Dr. Beth Richie and Janae Bonsu. In conversation today, offering critical reflections on the impact of past approaches and considerations for a new path forward. By way of introduction, Dr. Beth Richie is a longtime scholar, Black feminism activist, and head of the Department of Criminology, Law, and Justice at the University of Illinois, Chicago. As a founding member of Insight, Women, Gender Nonconforming, and Trans People of Color Against Violence, and author of numerous books on the intersection of gender violence, race, and criminal justice policy, Dr. Richie has made deeply profound and immense contributions to the anti-violence movement over the last 3 decades, and we are so grateful to have her with us today. She's joined in conversation by Janae Bonsu, who is an activist and social work PhD candidate, also at the University of Illinois, Chicago, where her research examines the intersections of gender-based violence, state violence, and survivor empowerment among Black women and gender nonconforming people. Bonsu coordinates the story collection project of BYP 100's She Safe, We Safe campaign to end gender-based violence in Black communities. Before we get started, just a reminder that we do have a Q&A feature for this session, so the chat is turned off, but you can enter any questions into that Q&A field, and hopefully we will get to them at the end of the session. So with that, I will pass the mic over to Beth and Janae.
Thank you. Context can go ahead and pin both Beth and Janae and unpin Virginia, and make sure your ASL interpreter is still pinned.
So we're ready to go?
I would say go ahead and keep talking, and hopefully Complex can pin you pretty soon.
Good. Happy to go ahead and keep talking. Well, thank you, Futures. Thank you, Virginia. Thank you, steering committee members. Love you, Debbie Lee. And thank you, supporters, for this event. I want to give a special appreciation to the conference organizers, all of the people who do the hard work behind the scenes. To me, it seems like the labor is even more invisible in remote events, but I see you and appreciate you. I am Beth, and I am in Chicago. I'm on the stolen land of the Council of Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations. I'm really very moved to be here with people from so many places, geographically, professionally, and politically. Coming together to talk about non-carceral responses to gender violence, to consider what that might mean. I am thrilled almost beyond words to be sharing this time with Janae Bonsu and A Long Walk Home. And you'll understand why very soon, but get ready, because you should know that looking to the next generation of smart, dedicated, creative, radical leaders, there are few people that I think of as more ready to carry us forward than the people who are at A Long Walk Home and Janae Bonsu. For me, Janae moves with a kind of intentional integrity, with honesty and humility, with crystal clear clarity, and with a commitment to survivors that's unmatched. And importantly, she does that work with the Black feminist queer lens. Janae, I appreciate you and respect you with my full heart. Part of my appreciation comes from the way she reminds me and others that we have to hold a love of Black people centrally in our work at this time. And for anyone who shares that love, which I hope everyone in the audience does, we have to take a moment to not only think about the love, but appreciate the Black death that has bombarded our senses over the last year, but of course, predating the uprisings. Indeed, for me, this conference comes at a time when there's a critical challenge to reconcile racial violence with what we have thought of as gender violence, as if they're different things. It's a moment where, as an anti-violence movement, we cannot ignore racial violence. We cannot ignore it any longer. And indeed, your choice of music reminds us, right? Reminds me that it's time for all good people to come around. Janae?
Yeah, thank you, Beth. I too would like to thank the conference organizers at Futures Without Violence and the steering committee and everyone, who behind the scenes made this conference possible. I know that this conference was delayed by a year, but, I really like to believe that everything happens in divine time. So, there's just been so much that has happened that we've seen collectively and experienced and lost and gained since April 2020, when this conference was supposed to happen. There's so much that the pandemic alone has caused us to sacrifice and restructure. I mean, even the fact of us being in a virtual room right now is a testament to that. The pandemic also brought new challenges to contend with, like, the risks and consequences of domestic violence during stay-at-home orders, among so many other things, right? There's so many lives that have been lost from the public health crisis that is COVID-19, as well as the lives that have continued to be lost and at risk from the public health crisis that is domestic violence, and the public health crisis that is gun violence and other forms of community violence, and the public health crisis that is police violence, none of which are mutually exclusive and need to be talked about, in the interconnected way that they exist. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be here with you all, albeit virtually, and to really put all of these public health crises in that interconnected context. We're meeting here exactly 1 week after police in Columbus, Ohio, shot and killed a 16-year-old Black girl named Ma'Khia Bryant, who called the police for help at her foster home, where she reported that other girls were trying to stab her. And the police responded to that situation of violence with 4 gunshots. So we cannot talk about domestic violence and community violence and different forms of state violence in isolation, because Ma'Khia is yet another case that shows how carceral responses to violence against marginalized people too often exacerbates violence, even to a fatal point. So we are very, very long overdue to detach ourselves from the carceral state. And by carceral state, I mean, I'm referring to the punitive policies and practices of institutions of the criminal legal system. All of that said, I'm very, very grateful to be able to be in conversation about this with Dr. Beth Richie, who is someone that I have looked to and admired for a long time now. Dr. Richie really brings her full, whole self to this work with such grace and authenticity, and she's been an exemplar of Black feminist activist scholarship for me. And so before we really get into it, I just want to publicly just thank you, Dr. Richie, for being an amazing mentor for me. And you know, thinking about this talk got me to thinking about when I actually first met you 7 years ago in April 2014. I was super fresh in my organizing work. I was a master's student at the University of Chicago at the time. And you were speaking on a panel of some sort. And I just bought a copy of your book, Arrested Justice, and I nervously waited after the talk to ask for you to sign my book. And you were just so humble and warm, and you signed my book and said that in your signature, you wrote that I hope these words will inform the world you are struggling to create for freedom and in sisterhood, Beth. And that message was such a foreshadowing, because this book has in fact informed my analysis of patriarchal violence and the work to end it so much that 7 years later, you ended up on my dissertation committee. And we've been able to work together in a number of movement and academic contexts. So I just want to note this full circle moment from the point that you signed my book, and really appreciate you and your work, because there's so many lessons just in this text alone that I want to make sure that people in this virtual room leave with today. So that said, I just want to briefly kind of preface what I believe we will discuss today. Hopefully we can get it all in the time that we're allotted, but we want to take this time to have an intergenerational dialogue of sorts, wherein we share our genealogy as Black feminist anti-violence activists in order to share lessons about over-reliance on carceral solutions and raise some challenges, and leave folks with some recommendations and calls to action. So let's start with you, Dr. Richie. Can you tell us about your pathway into anti-violence work and just what moves you into this space?
Well, thank you. I mean, part of what moves me is that beautiful remembrance of our co-journey, Janae. I appreciate it. And so anyway, thank you. There are many people in this space, because I saw the names of some of the people who are here who have been with me on this journey for close to 40 years of movement work to end gender violence. And I invite all of you, those who've traveled with me for 40 years, and those who are kind of more recently engaging in this work, to sort of pause and allow a reflection on the distance that we've come, the distractions that we faced, the danger to society, to survivors that have resulted from our somewhat problematic detours, and therefore, importantly, the need for course correction to set a new direction towards justice and freedom. That's what I hope my story will do. And I chose to do that instead of rehearsing the success of the anti-violence movement. And there are appropriate times to talk about the fundamental ways that the world is different because of anti-violence work. But I want to share my story more as a cautionary tale of what happens when we as a movement don't center radical values, aspirational commitments, and I'm going to call that abolition. I'll explain it a little bit later. Radical values, aspirational commitments, and the voices of those who need us the most in the center of their work. Again, I do so recognizing the success of this conference, the success of many of your individual lives in working against patriarchal violence. I raise these cautions with honor and respect, with humility, but also with a great deal of frustration. Hopefully we'll end it with some urgent optimism. 40 years into this, I think we have a chance to get it right. To put an end to patriarchal violence that survivors faced. And as you said, Janae, the patriarchal violence as it's linked to so many other violences that the anti-violence movement hasn't centered in our work, but that survivors have really needed from us. All of the ways that people are degraded and erased and excluded and killed that we haven't yet attended to. Honestly, I think we have a chance to do that now. And honestly, I don't think we're going to get a lot of other chances. So my work against gender violence began as a racial justice activist. Like many other women of color 40 years ago, I was immersed in community organizing work around health and education and occupation, the environment, looking at the conditions that were limiting the lives of Black and other people of color, conditions that were really violence in our communities. For me, that meant working on food justice issues, safe childcare resources, increased mental health services, building affordable housing, creating cultural institutions, all things that survivors of gender violence need, but weren't framed that way. I was in New York City at the time. I thought this was holistic work, and it meant for me that the work was about meeting immediate needs, but also shifting power. The demand that we had at the time was, we demand more of what we need, and that demand was embedded, more of what we need is what we deserve. What we need is what we deserve. And that made it justice work. A lot of people now talk about abolition as an aspirational goal, working against violence. Abolition for me in this context means what we need is what we deserve, and we work for both, and that's justice work. It became obvious to me that in the absence of attention to gender oppression or erasure of sexuality or the denial that patriarchy could exist in racial justice formations, the women and queer people leading the organization were doing so while experiencing sexual harassment, battering, rape, and other forms of patriarchal violence. It was as if in those spaces, racism was the only form of domination that mattered. And it meant that leaders and activists, neighbors, people involved in the struggle couldn't fully participate. And trying to change that led me and others to try to find the newly emerging anti-violence movement. This was in New York City at the time. When I got there, many of you who've been in this work with me for 40 years, there you were, right? I found you a space where where violence included attention to gender oppression, where issues of violence were understood to prohibit activism, where feminist analysis prevailed. We talked about how homelessness was different for women, how educational failure affected girls. Lack of a living wage was a different issue for trans people trying to work. Finally, there was a place where gender mattered. Gender mattered, but race, culture, class, language, disability, immigration status, indigenous affiliation didn't. All of those things got lost under a gender essential narrative. So on the one hand, there was a narrative of sisterhood, just as there was an analysis of racial solidarity. And then we realized that it wasn't real. It didn't work. The violence would continue unless those two things came together. Now, I just want to pause for a minute and say I'm talking about this we. The we are BIPOC activists, women of color survivors, queer organizers, disability justice warriors, poor people, criminalized, incarcerated survivors. I can't speak for everyone, but I just want to say two things that I think I can say with confidence. One, every person who doesn't know about the history of how people were pushed out of the mainstream anti-violence movement because we had an intersectional analysis. If you don't know the history of how there was intentional ways of narrowing the focus to gender, we need to share that history. Part of that history is the formation of autonomous women of color crisis intervention organizations, of task forces and state coalitions, of community groups coming together with women of color and others trying to negotiate space and negotiate services and negotiate analysis. We did trainings to try to have people understand what structural racism was. We met with allies working alongside of us. And I say this quickly, but if you don't know Insight or Love and Protect or the DC Rape Crisis Center or Sister Song or the Black Women's Health Project, Mujeres Unidas, the Asian Women's Center, if you don't know the organizing that for 40 years, women of color and other groups who've been excluded from the mainstream anti-violence movement did, it's time to go back to school. You have to learn that history because that's part of the story of why carceral responses are so dangerous for some people who need our care. The good news is we've got younger activists like Janae here to teach us. And from a different generational perspective, we can understand the disastrous effects that our legacy by relying on carceral solutions have led. So let me just finish up really quickly with a few points, Janae. One, while we were trying to color up the mainstream anti-violence movement and bring a feminist analysis to racial justice work, all around us, we were witnessing the expansive way that danger and oppression was being captured in the buildup of a prison nation, the use and legitimacy of state violence, and carceral feminism. Carceral feminism is the ignoring of the way that different groups are differently affected by a police state, by a carceral state, by state violence. We saw it coming. And the problem is that even though we saw it coming and we said it's coming and we shouted that it's coming, people didn't listen to us. And there was a sort of wave that got caught, that the anti-violence movement got caught up in, of carceral expansion, where problems were solved by punishment, not prevention. And the state had the authority and the power to use or to disperse punishment rather than looking toward accountability. So while we're developing shelters and rape crisis centers and hospital-based programs and academic training programs, evaluation studies, Black girls are starting to be held in cages as part of their discipline. Undocumented trans people are being arrested because they've got the wrong ID. Latinx boys are being gunned down in Chicago, Black women terrorized by the police. These are survivors of gender violence and state violence. Their demand for justice must be part of what we respond to. By not responding, it means that we are leaving them in the wake of danger, and that's not righteous anti-violence work. So I'll leave it there, reminding us that for the 2,000 almost people who were gathered here, there are people who are in danger right now because we have failed to find them where they are. We have left them without resources. We've said, call 911. They don't have a phone. They can't call 911. It's not a safe option for them. And we need to do better this time around. Janae, I'm going to turn it over for your story to hear, what you think about working for justice in this dangerous time and some of the things that brought you to this work and the lessons that you've learned.
Yeah, I mean, there's just so much in what you just shared. And in a kind of a disheartening way, so much that is still very relevant today, like a lot of the same fights that you had to take on 40 years ago is ongoing. And in many ways, as an activist of a younger generation, I look to so many of the organizations that you named, including Insight, as a continuance of the work. But to kind of trace my story, my journey to this work of anti-violence has a few pivotal points, but one of the earliest for me was before I even considered myself to be an activist. This was Christmas Day of 2010. I was in a very abusive relationship. And so on Christmas, I survived a really terrifying encounter of intimate partner violence. A couple of years of abuse had culminated to that day when I literally feared for my life. And I was able to escape to my mother's house. And, she saw how distraught and disheveled I was and was worried that my partner would find me there because he, knew where my mother lived. And, she was afraid that he would come and cause more harm. And so she called the police. And when the police finally arrived, the responding officers could only seem to focus on what I had done to incite the violence against me, because to them somehow it had to be my fault. You know, my immediate and continued safety was not really a concern to them. They told me that there wasn't enough evidence to obtain a restraining order, and that, you know, next time I should just try to not make my partner so angry, and that they had more pressing matters to deal with. And so, needless to say, I felt very disregarded and dismissed. And even still, you know, that one anecdote, and what I had continued on to learn about police responses to domestic violence, I considered myself actually lucky, because there are other people who have, you know, experienced further victimization in the form of actual, like being arrested with these dual arrest or mandatory arrest policies, and having had children taken away, or undocumented women being funneled into deportation proceedings and other kind of consequences of police responses to domestic violence. So I considered myself lucky that I had only, for lack of a better word, been dismissed and disregarded. But in any case, that experience really catalyzed my commitment to do whatever I could to not only prevent violence from abusive partners, but to also eliminate the further victimization that survivors often experience from institutions that are supposed to help, right? And so, you know, as the feminist mantra goes, the personal is political, right? And so those personal experiences and those of countless other people across the gender spectrum are what ground my political commitments to abolitionist feminism. And, you know, that shows up in my organizing efforts and in my scholarship. So it was not long after, you know, a few years later, after that incident, I was politicized in a national organization of young Black activists and organizers aged 18 to 35 called BYP 100, which is short for Black Youth Project 100. I was among the first group of people to join the member-based organization after its founding. And it was there that I kind of developed as an organizer over the past 7 years now. And so 3 years ago, BYP 100, we had multiple chapters across the country running, you know, grassroots issue-based campaigns, but we had never had an overarching kind of national campaign to kind of advance our politic as, you know, an abolitionist Black feminist organization, right? And so we debated internally what we should take on as our first national campaign. And at the time, I had been a student of sorts of insight and critical resistance, and you know, read and reread the joint statement on gender violence in the prison industrial complex. And it was such a North Star for me because it so eloquently articulates the pervasive problem of interpersonal and state violence that exists at so many intersections. Like this plaque behind me, that is a statement. That's the statement of on gender violence in the prison industrial complex. Like, it's just so important that I just need to keep it around to consistently reference it. But using that kind of statement as my guide, I proposed that we, as an organization, take on a campaign that would focus on creating structures and conditions that produce safety for gender oppressed people that are often further victimized rather than protected by the police and other formal state institutions. Because BYP 100, as I mentioned, is an abolitionist organization that also holds what we call a Black queer feminist lens as a core value and a politic, which means that we are vigilant in focusing our methods and stories and solutions on those that society deems most deviant and most undeserving of justice, so that, you know, we all may be free. And so I felt that it was imperative to reduce Black women and girls and gender nonconforming people's contact with policing through policy and community generation responses to harm that prioritize survivors' self-determination and safety. And so this campaign came to be known as She Safe, We Safe. Our members, just so many of us knew from lived experience that the persistent violence that we experience within our households and within our communities is connected to the direct violence and neglect that we experience from the state. And just to be clear, when I say the state, I'm referring to governmental institutions that organize our society, including police and law enforcement agencies, public schools, child protective services, welfare agencies, public housing. Those all encompass the state, right? And so people in positions of authority within state institutions and the policies that regulate them have all in some way perpetrated physical, sexual, psychological, and structural violence. And so it's with that belief that all of those forms of violence were intertwined, we sought to disconnect and dismantle them through two goals that we set for the She Safe, We Safe campaign. The first was to increase interventions to gender-based violence that are available to Black communities that do not rely on contact with the police through skill building, relationship building, and structures. And the second goal was to invest in community-determined interventions and programs that address gender-based violence in Black communities through policy and budget advocacy that empowers people to assume agency over public funds. And so eventually after this campaign was launched, I had transitioned out of my staff role of BYP 100 to focus on completing my dissertation, but I maintained my connection to the work that I was deeply connected to and excited about by spearheading the story collection project of the campaign. So the story collection project was an effort to collect stories of Black folks' experiences of gendered violence, stories of how folks have addressed violence and harm outside of policing, and our visions for what our communities need in order to build a world without state and gendered violence. And relatedly, my dissertation research examined the connection between violence that gender oppressed Black people experience in our homes and communities and institutions, and the impact that it has on our sense of safety and empowerment. So both research projects sought to provoke new understandings of resistance and tap into the radical imaginations of gender oppressed Black people to envision and build community-based interventions to patriarchal violence. And so the story collection project was a tool for connecting and building community. It launched on the cusp of the pandemic, so we had to pretty much do everything virtually, but telling stories and sharing visions for the world we want to live in was nonetheless a way for us to connect with each other and build the support and community that we need. I had led a team of people to collect stories in this multi-method project and analyzed data and stories from over 1,400 Black women and trans men and women and non-binary survivors, and held deep storytelling to inform campaign strategy on how to build towards safety. And so much was learned and reinforced for me through both projects, including how survivors actually define safety, which is very different from the idea of public safety that is kind of, I think in a lot of ways, public safety is equivalent to police departments. In city budgets, the line item for public safety is literally for law enforcement agencies, right? But survivors define safety very differently from that. I learned how people have responded and intervened in violence on their own and what type of responses they'd like to see. And by and large, story collection project participants overwhelmingly support community-based responses to gender-based violence, in particular, transformative justice interventions, including community accountability processes. These were the most reported or desired responses to gender-based violence that folks would like to see. And people were explicit about processes that don't involve police, processes that center survivors, and ways to hold people who cause harm accountable outside of the criminal legal system. And I'm sure I'll have a chance to kind of flesh out what transformative justice and community accountability is, but I want to kind of pop it back to you for a second, Beth, to ask you, given your 40 years in this movement, and what you have seen and understand and theorized about the carceral feminist unintended responses or consequences, what would you do differently, knowing what you know now about those unintended consequences?
Well, that's a really good question. What I would do differently. You know, oops. I guess I want to answer that by kind of saying to people who've been around for a while, almost 40 years or 30 years, maybe even 20 years, that part of what I think we haven't done is understood that when we meet needs without thinking about issues of justice, we fail those people who are most in danger. And that means we're only kind of doing part of what our work is. And I say that kind of a little bit hesitantly because I know people are working really hard to staff hotlines, to keep shelter beds open, to make sure that legislation passes, to keep coordinated community councils, whatever those things are called in the community, together. Like, this isn't to say people aren't working hard. Mm-hmm. This, for me, is to say that our work will be better. It will involve more people. It will lead to really preventing violence when we think not only about meeting crisis needs, but also thinking about justice. And I think that's what this opportunity is. And I think I would have pushed harder for that analysis to prevail. Instead, I think we got caught in the day-to-day operating of services, and services is not safety. And we're not going to get justice through trying to get more funding for our programs. Now, I want to really say, because I have to say it over, I know that there are some people who are better off because of the way the anti-violence movement evolved. But it's also important, and I wish there had been a way to say this more convincingly earlier. It's important to note that even though there's some people who are better off, other people have been hurt by the way that our services emerge from carceral approaches instead of justice-oriented solutions. And I think the challenge is, how do we step into the work now of building a different world, understanding all of the forms of violence that are killing people, either like the literal death or the death for the rest of your life. How do we convince people of that? And one of the ways I think we do, Janae, is to focus on, as you have said, the intersection, the overlap, the criminalized survivors, and how that is a direct product of our over-reliance on the criminal legal system to solve problems that have deep roots in other kinds of places. You know, I think it's a choice we have to make almost at this point. And I wish we had had this moment of reconciling earlier, but it's a moment we have now, and I think we have to choose to do different kind of work. So I wonder, Janae, what you would do differently, or maybe you could just say a little bit more about what you think the Black feminist lens offers us to doing different kind of work. We don't have a lot of time, but either one of those questions.
Yeah. I'd say a few things. First, and I think that the things that we can do, right, is different depending on what your current role is in this work, right? Whether you're an advocate or a healthcare provider or social worker or what have you. But one thing that I can say to everyone is, first, to believe survivors who don't fit into this good or perfect victim mold. That is so critically important, because these survivors are not only excluded from services often through failure to meet program criteria or guidelines, but also maybe entrapped in the web or surveillance that casts them as criminals rather than survivors of violence that are deserving of safety and resources. I've also learned a lot from the Oakland chapter of Critical Resistance in this regard of like what different types of providers can do. And so the Oakland Power Project's was a community-based participatory research project and campaign that had the goal of identifying current harms and amplifying existing resources and developing new practices that don't rely on policing solutions. And part of this multi-phase research project included service providers imagined solutions for direct resources in practitioner education and community education to keep Oakland residents safe. And so some of the direct resources included processes to get care after sexual assault that does not mandate calling the police, creating a health resource and services map, including non-institutional resources, and someone highly skilled in mental health counseling and substance use who could immediately respond to crisis calls. Like this is the type of participatory and emancipatory research, applied research that we need much more of across the country, not just in Oakland, to really center what survivors of or marginalized identities and who are at the nexus of interlocking systems of oppression actually need to not further victimize them. In terms of like advocates in DV programs, I know that, and I'm a licensed social worker myself, so I kind of exist in some tensions with some of my politics and some of the policies and practices that kind of steer the field in many ways. But I know that a lot of DV programs focus their efforts on safety planning and emotional support, which is great. But it's not great when it's at the expense of advocacy with survivors for access to needed resources and opportunities to transform conditions. When asking survivors in the story collection project, as well as my own dissertation research, just, what does safety mean to you? What does that look like? So often they name material resources as key to safety, like things that should not even be a thing that we're without, like food and housing and money, like cash, direct financial support, et cetera. Access to healthcare. I don't know how I didn't name that first, because that was one of the top responses. Like, these are just material needs that people have that make them feel unsafe when it is layered on top of some type of physical abuse or sexual abuse or emotional abuse, right? So in advocacy efforts, safety planning and emotional support is very, very, very important. And also, when linked with systems advocacy, work to decouple collaborative and funding ties between law enforcement and other institutions like public housing and schools and healthcare that Black women and girls rely on to navigate and survive, like that is key. So I would say, bringing together individual and systems advocacy as complementary efforts to meet individuals' immediate material needs and working to change systems at the same time. In terms of healthcare, there was a lot that came up, especially among trans and gender nonconforming folks in the story collection project and my dissertation research that talks about just wanting to have medical systems, medical practitioners that are respectful and supportive. And that might seem like very minor, like something to brush off, but it's so critical when you have a trans person or a gender nonconforming person in front of you and you can't even get their pronouns right. Like that is just exacerbating the trauma that they're likely coming to you for in the first place, right? Misgendering is in itself a form of, I think, emotional abuse, right? And so, just respect for TGNC people seeking care that is devoid of judgment and bias, I think is critically important. To pull on the Oakland Power projects again, there was a lot that came up around practitioner education and training, which includes training in prison industrial complex related issues for healthcare practitioners, better language access, de-escalation practice guidelines, and better connection between clinics and healthcare providers throughout the city, particularly those that are intentional about not turning toward cops. Again, just talking about access to healthcare, free healthcare. I know that, there's a lot of barriers to having, health insurance and being able to afford medical care, et cetera. But there has to be some workarounds to be able to have fair sliding scales or some pro bono services or something, because no one should be denied any treatment based on insurance plan or income or lack of insurance, because this just came up so much, especially when talking about Black folks and Black survivors. You know, formal institutions or formal networks of support are not often the first to go to, but when it does happen, when we do take that route, we don't want to be, you know, further disempowered because of, you know, being denied access to the care. It took us so long to even muster up the, I don't know, courage is not the word I want to look for, but, you know, actually reach out to that service. And I mentioned transformative justice earlier, and just by definition, transformative justice is a framework to describe an approach to processes for addressing harm that seeks to not only address the specific situation of harm in question, but to transform the conditions and social forces that made that harm possible. And, you know, transformative justice is something that, to hold some type of transformative justice process, that is something that is should be held with people who are closest to the harm, right? And so I think that it's important. I don't think that transformative justice processes and processes of community accountability can be held necessarily within formal, you know, institutions like a DV programs or whatever. But I do think that it is still important, especially for advocates who are working with survivors. I think, you know, being versed in different restorative practices of sorts, like circles, like healing circles, and just being familiar with the framework, or working with survivors to work within their informal network to hold such processes, I think could be really important and could be really critical. I see Virginia popping up on the screen, so I think we're running out of time. There's so much more I can say, but I do have to say one last thing though before we end. I think it's really important for whatever your role is in the anti-violence movement to acknowledge that sexual violence in particular is systematically perpetrated by the people and institutions that are supposed to be sources of safety and solutions to violence. I'm thinking especially about police here. There's currently no official data collection on sexual violence by law enforcement. There's in turn no non-criminal legal responses to it aimed at prevention or accountability. And so as folks who support survivors of sexual violence, it is really important to understand and remember that sexual violence happens or is perpetrated by law enforcement as well, and to think about protocols to respond to that if and how if it is disclosed somehow, and just to be cognizant of that. Yeah, I'll pause there and hopefully take some questions from Virginia.
Yeah, so I just want to say people are definitely inspired and energized in the chat. And really, you know, what you're sharing is resonating. People are curious and really want to hear more about your perspectives on some of these issues. So I have had to put my reading glasses on. We're going to take a couple of questions from the audience. And we only have a couple minutes. So First question, can you talk a little bit more about your vision for addressing root causes of gender violence, and specifically what healthcare providers can do to address this?
Do you want me to go, Janae? I think, and then you can I'll start. Dehumanizing people, sort of making them only bodies, not, you know, with the soul, hierarchies of inequality, reinforcing power and privilege, all of those to me are the root causes of violence. And, you know, they show up in different ways in institutions than they do in relationships, than they do between adults and children. But I think the root cause of it is power and dehumanization, and all that gets motivated or animated, like capitalism, like the medical industrial complex, like all of these things. And so I would say that in the practice of healthcare, we need to ask ourselves and our institutions, and we need to ask our policies and ask our research, what about this is about power abuse, is about hierarchy, is about dehumanizing people? And if anything we do is about those things, then it's part of the problem, not part of the solution, including how we do exams when people have been hurt, whether we require reporting when people say, oh, please don't report, when we ignore certain bodies because we can't understand them, right? So I think part of it is sort of a inventory of those things about our own practice, so that we're starting to live our values around a different kind of world. And that's what I mean when I say we have to create a different kind of world, not just a different kind of world like out there for those people, but in everything that we do, including the delivery of healthcare. I would say the delivery of education. I would say the same delivery of social services, delivery of childcare, et cetera.
Thank you. All right, we're going to do one more question, and this is actually speaking to the domestic violence advocates that we have in the House. What are some concrete steps that domestic violence shelters can take immediately to reduce the use of police and state sanctioned violence?
Well, I mean, I spoke to this a bit, just in terms of really decoupling collaborative and to the extent possible funding ties with law enforcement agencies. And I mean, just even beyond law enforcement specifically, I think there's many ways that carceral logics, which, you know, are the ways that the criminal legal system operates on things like isolation and blame and control and surveillance and punishment. Those carceral logics often creep into the types of institutions that we're talking about, including shelters. I mean, this is from survivors' mouths, right? The types of controlling, surveilling policies that undermine their self-determination in agencies within these shelters. So I think that there are ways that that shelter workers, advocates can have a paradigmatic shift of sorts away from carceral logics and logics of punishment, and really just constantly flex your imagination to challenge yourself of what hasn't yet been done in your institutional setting and carve out a role in making it happen. I think even beyond professional settings, we can start with how we deal with conflict and harm that happens in the organizations and agencies within which we work, and in the context of our everyday lives within and outside of professional settings, because this is a critical moment for us to re-examine our work and our practices and our interventions, so that these carceral logics are not reproduced. So we can instead become strengthened by our vision for a more anti-racist, equitable culture that's deeply rooted in a commitment to anti-oppression. So I would say definitely to challenge your everyday practices within your institutions, regardless of whether or not it explicitly deals with law enforcement.
Virginia, can I add I'm just going to shout out some things. Go on the website of Survived and Punished. Read The Moment of Truth. Get a copy of the CR Insight Statement that's behind Janae. Read documents by BYP 100. Join activist groups in your community, even though you think it's not part of your work to show up at a demonstration. It is part of our work to show up at a demonstration that's about ending violence. And then I think this is a particular moment. There are so many opportunities to go to a webinar or go on the screen and hear people talking about abolition feminism. It's specifically in the context of anti-violence work. And then lastly, you know, by the end of this conference, you could have an amazing bibliography of books and zines and videos that people can watch. There is so much that we can take in to educate ourselves about the importance of this work. It's on us if we don't know it at this point.
Did you name your own book, Beth? Also read Arrested Justice for folks who want to dig in deeper. I'm going to say it if you're not.
Thank you, Janae.
We could have this conversation for hours. And I think it is perfect to end on a point that Janae brought up, which is radical imagination. How can we re-envision the work that we're doing to prevent and respond to violence and not be limited by the structures that we have seen for many years? If they're not working, it's time to figure out something different. So thank you so much. Lots of thought-provoking and just important messages that you shared today. And we are going to end our opening session with a video and performance from a Chicago-based organization called A Long Walk Home. They use art to educate, engage, and empower young people to end violence against girls and women with programs like the Black Girl Freedom Fund and #SayHerName, the Rakia Boyd Memorial Project. So I have the great honor of passing it over to artist, youth organizer, and A Long Walk Home co-founder, Scheherazade Tillet, and she's going to share more about their work and introduce our performers.
Hi, everyone. Whoa, that was a lot to come after some of the most powerful and respected people that I have in this movement, Beth Richie, and Janae, thank you so much for not only all the work that you do, but for being collaborators and really allowing A Long Walk Home to really do this work. I love you and I'm grateful for you guys, and I thank you as well. I'm also just really honored to be here at this conference. I know it's 2 years of planning, and so I want to just give all the thanks to all the people who've been planning this conference and allowing us to be at this space. My name again is Scheherazade Tillet. I'm the co-founder of A Long Walk Home, along with my sister Salamisha Tillet. We use art to empower young people to end violence. We are, as survivors, as artists and activists, we center the leadership and the voices of Black women and girls. I lastly want to just dedicate our presentation and performance to two young girls. And this is, you know, I think for us doing this work, this is a critical moment, but it's a critical week, particularly of what we've experienced last week. It's a very emotional week for those that are centering and caring about the liberation of Black girls. And then for this reason, I would like to dedicate this performance to Ma'Khia Brown, who was killed, Ma'Khia Bryant, who was killed 1 week ago to this very hour in Ohio. And also I would like to dedicate this to a young girl named Hope, a young Black girl who is in Chicago and who's 10 years old and is a survivor of both sexual violence and child sexual exploitation. And she is currently, justice has not been served for her. And also as well as her care is being evaluated in terms of services, and a group of I think what Janae was talking about, this idea of who's a perfect victim, a group of organizations in Chicago, racial justice and gender-based organizations have collaborated to seek her justice. And so I would like to dedicate this space, our performance that is centering amazing Black women and girls, and bring them their energy and to this space. I will be showing a brief video from A Long Walk Home that showcases our work right before the pandemic, but also goes to the current and imaginations in terms of our work with the Black Girl Freedom Fund, which is a fund that is giving resources and centering Black girls and imagining the liberation. So I would like to play the video.
If the tech support team could just bring up the video. Thanks so much.
This is a poem to my girlfriends who sing and whop and write and curse and can period poo their way out of any situation. This is a poem to my girlfriends who have girlfriends who inhale and exhale and downward dog who when I say here comes my anxiety, they say oh dang, they go mine too. I would like to write a poem to honor my girlfriends. To the ones who push pins to their skin, to the ones who are forced onto someone else's, to the ones who wear moccasin like battle armor because they know that this world is a war paint against them, to the ones who smile in the midst of a battle zone, and to those who carry the battle zones in their hearts, to the ones that always look for something to smile about with broken eyes, and eyes that don't grow weary, and eyes afraid to close, but I am never afraid to open myself up to you because I know that your heart is a place that I can exist in. I feel like the girls who have to take a long walk home deserve a poem.
So Scheherazade and I started Along Walk Home in 2003, and our main program at that time was Story of a Rape Survivor, a multimedia performance in which Scheherazade documented my own healing and recovery from being a sexual assault survivor. So we'd go around the country and go to various community centers and college campuses. And when we went to these college campuses, one thing that kind of kept on happening were that young people in the audience, college students, would tell us that they had been sexually assaulted. A vast majority of them had been sexually assaulted before they came to college. So from our point of view, we understood that there were these teenagers, people in high school and or middle school, who were being sexually assaulted and didn't really have the resources or the vocabulary or the access to be able to help themselves or help each other overcome this severe trauma.
I feel like a big thing that the program does is put a name to our trauma, like working us through ways of solving it, and they have opened our eyes to many of the experiences that we've been through. They were educating us on like we can't have one solution because we don't have one solution problems. The word that they used to describe was intersectionality. There is sexual violence, police harassment, mental health, domestic violence. It's so many things that we need to address.
I think A Long Walk Home has really helped us understand what it means when people say Black women as well as Black girls are at intersections of violence. That if we're going to talk about gun violence, but we also have to call these names as well. If we're going to talk about police violence, we have to call these names as well. We have a narrow conversation about violence and we must expand that conversation.
To empower a Black girl to be a leader, you have to shift everything around them for them to be seen. So you have to like shift and have partnerships with their families. So we start off with like having orientation. You have to shift and educate the schools, like their voices are being heard. Then you have to also shift like the laws that impact them to do this work. It's like philanthropy. So like Along Walk Home had to help create portfolios and advocate at different foundations. So it's not just that we have to just work on the girl. Once we do that, we realize all these barriers that were put to actually do our work.
The Black Girl Freedom Fund, our vision, our dream, and we will get there, is over 10 years to have $1 billion for Black girls, right? And I want to know, what would you do with that? Like, we kind of like lay down the land of like a lot of different things that are impacting Black girls. I want to hear from you, like, what would you do with $1 billion?
If I had $1 billion, I'd listen to Black girls. I'd give them much more opportunities to have platforms like this and to focus on being Black girls. I mean, now, even as this pandemic has started, I feel like all of the time that was supposed to be my childhood, I was planning my childhood for later on in life and planning out times in my life where I wouldn't have to worry about all of my family and worry about providing for others. where I could just focus on myself. And that is my goal for Black girls, to be a Black girl and to love yourself, and that be your only responsibility. So if I had $1 billion, Black girls would be in therapy, they'd be in dance classes, they'd have outlets, they'd have people that listen to them indefinitely. They wouldn't feel like a burden, and they wouldn't have the weight of the world on them. If I had $1 billion, people would realize and recognize just how much Black girls and Black women carry our societies, and how they're at the crown up for everybody else. And I'd let Black girls realize that it's okay to take a break, and it's okay to not do everything, and it's not your responsibility to. Hello, my name is Azaria Baker. I'm the girl you've seen both times in those previous videos. And the poem that me and my girlfriends are going to recite to you today was written in healing circles by girlfriends as a reflection of George Floyd's and Breonna Taylor's deaths. And this poem has even more relevance now as we face the new death of Ma'Khia Bryant, because it's our duty to remind Black girls that we're going to be all right.
We're going to be all right because the maps have already been created by our mothers, grandmothers, and all of those who weren't martyrs but stolen from the movement too soon. Because their deaths have to mean something. Because our protests have to mean something. Because every day the sun will come and shine as we try to change the world's state of mind. We're going to be all right.
We're going to be all right as long as Black girls lead us to freedom. As long as we love each other, protect each other, and don't expect anyone else to free us. As long as we remember we have always had everything we needed. That's why everybody else wants to be us. As long as we love on our brothers, sisters, and mothers, cousins and them, those on the block, yeah, them too. As long as Black joy is always seen as a tool of resistance, we're going to be all right. We're going to be all right if we don't leave Black girls and women behind, if we retrain our eyes to see Black girls as holy and sacred, if we teach Black girls to say amen to themselves, if we use the magic that our ancestors gave us to nurture our spirits, if we care for ourselves and know that God got us, then we're going to be all right.
We gonna be all right when we don't have to fight both day and night for our rights, when police don't go into fight or flight every time they see a Black shadow. We are tired of living in Black shadows. When they take their knees off our necks, we can't breathe. No, we can't breathe when sleeping at home is not a signed death certificate, when the world stops looking past the present of the future of our Black women and girls. When society realizes Black women run the world, we have been saving them for centuries without hesitation, without question or a thank you. We do it all again if we had to. When Black men become a safe space for Black women. When the answer to Black Lives Matter is not all lives matter. When Black people are seen as human, not superhuman, not less than human, just human. When Black girls, all Black girls, I mean Black trans, Black queer, Black disabled, Black poor, Black non-binary, Black old, are seen as necessary and not dispensable. We gonna be all right. Only then will we be all right. Ms. Tiller, you're muted.
Thank you, girls. Thank you, Jada, Azaria, and Brooklyn for sharing your creativity and your leadership here and reminding us of our work as adults to protect you guys and to lead you guys and give you resources and hope that every girl will be all right. Thank you.
Whew. Thank you so much to all of our amazing keynote speakers and performers. I'm sure that everyone here will agree that our conference is off to a great start. So I hope you enjoy your first workshop session coming up after a very short break. We're going to start up at the top of the hour. I also encourage you to check out the Healing Through Writing offering this evening. I'm going to sign off as your MC for today so I can actually attend some of the sessions as well. And I will see you all tomorrow morning. Thank you so much.